Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have two very special guests with us today. We have powerhouse guests. We have Dr. Timothy Shanahan and Nathaniel Hansford, better known as Nate Joseph. Yay! We've been talking about the subject of knowledge, and Judy and I had a controversial conversation that stirred up a lot of activity on our Facebook page. I think Nate disappeared for a second. Hopefully, he'll come back. Um, Anyhow, there were a lot of people who were asking about the place of knowledge. They were not happy about, what we were discussing. Some people want to know more about the role of knowledge, background knowledge, and also where a new curriculum now with knowledge building fits in, because that seems to be what people are talking about. Everybody seems to be wanting to buy a knowledge building curriculum. And we want to know, is this curricula necessary? We want to know what the research is on it. We want to know the research on background knowledge. So we have Dr. Tim Shanahan with us today. He was one of the people who was instrumental in the National Reading Panel. He is a distinguished professor at the University of Illinois of Chicago, and he just wrote a book called Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives, an outstanding book about how reading instruction has been misinterpreted and misapplied for decades, and how to write the course to improve reading skills for all students. Dr. Shanahan has been, very involved in literacy for many years. He has the Shanahan on Literacy blog that I am a loyal reader. I followed it for years, and it's very exciting to have him here with us today. We have Nate Joseph, a repeat no BS bestie with the Literacy View, and he has written a book, and a new edition is coming out in March 2026 called The Scientific Principles of Reading and Writing Instruction, Bridging the Divide Between Educational Practice and Research. And he specializes in using meta-analysis research to help teachers implement proven methodologies. So we welcome you both here to the Literacy View. It's an absolute honor to have two powerhouse guests with us today. And we are going to start off with Tim today. Tim, please fill us in with what is the research on background knowledge. Let's start right there, and then we could get into some of the controversy after.
Okay. Thank you, Faith and Judy, for having me here, and good to see Nate. And this will be fun, I hope. When it comes to, well, first of all, let me just pick on the term background knowledge. We're not real consistent in the world about how we refer to what we're talking about. In some studies, it's world knowledge, and then some they're just domain knowledge and background knowledge and cultural literacy and all these different terms that get used interchangeably. What they're all trying to get at is information about the world, information about ideas and the natural world, the social world, all that kind of stuff. Background knowledge really refers to the knowledge that a reader brings to the text. It's what do you already know before you start reading it? And so I kind of like it as reader knowledge more than background knowledge, because background knowledge maybe makes it too narrow, that it's just what you know about this text, but you can actually use your knowledge a bit more flexibly than that. And you can, use it by analogy and so on and so forth. So it gets a little precious. But essentially, there are really two major issues when it comes to this topic. And one of those is, what role does background knowledge or reader knowledge play in the reading comprehension process? Where does it fit? Is it important? That kind of thing. And the second part really has to do with more instructional kinds of issues of what should we be doing as educators with background and with this knowledge. How should we be going about creating it? How should we be guiding kids to use it when they're reading, and so on? And so a bunch of really two categories. One is the psychological, what's going on in people's heads, and the other one is, what should be going on in our classrooms. And so let me jump in on the first one, because I suspect we'll talk about it less than the instructional one. We're all teachers. We're all interested in that. Research over roughly just about 100 years now has been showing very clearly that background knowledge, reader knowledge, plays a clear role in reading comprehension. We use that knowledge to, in some cases, to reduce the cognitive demand on us. Authors put out a lot of information. The more of that information that I already know, the more I can focus my attention on other parts of the text. Somebody who has low knowledge is going to have to pay attention to everything in this text, or a lot of things in this text. Somebody who has a lot of prior knowledge is maybe going to be able to say, this is a really key idea, but I already know those 5 things. So it does that. It reduces the amount of cognitive demand. It certainly is a place for generating inferences. Authors often leave gaps. They don't necessarily fill them all the time. Sometimes they make connections, or they assume you're going to make connections, and so they don't tell you certain things. If you have relevant knowledge about that topic, you can often fill those kinds of gaps. So you have an advantage over readers who don't have that. At times, text is ambiguous. You can't tell, what the author's saying, but you can figure it out sometimes through your reliance on background knowledge. If you were just going on the words themselves, you might be misled, but because you can fill in gaps, or things about the social world. A simple example is, you get on public transportation, somebody steps on your foot, you say to them, "You're standing on my foot," and the person looks down and says, "Yes, I am." Clearly, they didn't understand what it was that you were trying to communicate. They took it literally. They didn't understand the social meaning of that. They were lacking that background knowledge, and so they were boorish instead of polite, not intentionally. So those kinds of things go on. And then finally, we often use knowledge by analogy. And so, I might not know a lot about the animal I'm reading about, but I know something about animals. And therefore, I might, it's almost whatever information you're giving me is kind of going into categories in my head, rather than, gee, it's new information that I have to build up, because I can use information that I already have to get at it, even though I don't necessarily know much about this topic. So there are lots of ways we use knowledge when we're reading. And I guess I'll point out one last thing about it. And sometimes we mislead ourselves. Knowledge has a cost. That reliance on knowledge has a cost. And therefore, at times, we misunderstand what we're being told or what we're reading, because we're pretty sure we know what the author is saying, and we're not necessarily paying that much attention to what they're really telling us, or we let our knowledge override. And there's some terrible historical examples of that, where presidents or state departments are pretty sure they know what a text means, despite what the words say, and they they make some bad choices. And there are examples in my wife's research showing that science students often misunderstand the physics book because they think they know how the world works, and what the research shows is it's actually quite different. And so they, even though the text is telling them how it works, they assume what it means is what's already in their head. So there are big benefits to having knowledge, and there's some costs to using it.
That's very interesting. Yeah, and I understand what you mean. We all come to a book with different background knowledge, and that could lead us in the wrong direction sometimes.
Absolutely.
For sure. So, Nate, are you there? I don't see you.
Just go to me. Just go to me, Faith. Keep going.
Okay. All right. He'll be back. So, Judy, as I'm listening to Dr. Shanahan talk about the role of background knowledge, it's clear there is research on background knowledge, and it's a necessary piece in terms of helping children to have a deeper understanding, and it frees up cognitive space so that they're not overloaded with all these other things.
Wait, say that again, Faith. So there is research. Explain that to me again.
So what Tim was saying is, yeah, there's research that knowledge is important.
And what does that research look like, though? Like from an application piece in the classroom, what does that what does that research look like?
So are you asking, do we need a program that provides that, or is it up to the teacher to provide some background knowledge for the child?
There's been so much in terms of knowledge, right? There's people screaming, oh, just because, you say that there's no evidence to say that, knowledge building or knowledge building programs going to shift outcomes means that you don't respect knowledge or that you don't value knowledge. And, I don't know if there's any research to support if a knowledge building program is
those are two different
outcomes versus this. So can that be clarified for me a little bit?
Nate, I'm going to jump to you. So we're talking about, I think, two different things with Judy's question, right? So is there research on a knowledge building program as opposed to background knowledge having research behind it as part of comprehension? Could you talk a little bit about that, Nate?
Yes, I can. And I just want to say before I begin, at the risk of having my camera or mic fade out on me again, it's an honor to be on the podcast. I'm really hoping to be your most repeat guest. And it's a super honor to be on a panel with Dr. Shanahan. I've interviewed him a couple of times, and I think he's the most referenced author in my book. So it feels really cool to be on a panel with him. So I think that's a really good question. And I think it really gets to the core of the issue here, because knowledge building and background knowledge are not really the same thing. I mean, background knowledge applies to almost any subject and any understanding you're going to have of any text. Knowledge building is a systematic attempt at building background knowledge via curriculum. And I think if our question is there, a large body of research support a systematic attempt at background knowledge building or knowledge building curriculum? I think the answer is almost certainly no. We don't have a large body of research. To the best of my knowledge, I'm aware of 4 studies on this topic. And none of them provide a very clear answer. So we have 2 that were previously done by Sonia Cabal on CQLA, and they did not specifically look at the issue of comprehension. And then we have one by Grismer et al. That was looking at charter schools, but it really only is looking at charter schools at a very specific knowledge building program, and there the effect sizes were quite low. So I don't think we have robust evidence to support the idea that background knowledge is necessary for comprehension in the sense of knowledge building, I should say.
Let's try to
Did
clarify
that come out? I had some very worried looking faces
Yes, you were going in and out, Nate. So
here.
let's try to clarify some of this. From what I heard, from what
Can you guys hear me?
We could hear you right now, but you were going
You guys
in
can't
and
hear
out.
me, can you?
We can hear you, but now you've disappeared. All right, we're going to go on with this. Dr. Shanahan, I don't know if you were able to follow what Nate was saying. It seemed to me that he was talking about how they're very different, how knowledge building as far as a curriculum is different from background knowledge, and that there is research that he was trying to talk about. I don't know if you're familiar with that research, but to the best of your understanding, could you shed some light for us on that topic?
Sure. And I do know at least some of that research. Essentially, over the last decade or so, people have put forth new curriculum, 21st century curriculum, I guess, for teaching reading, where they focus on content. They focus on trying to get kids learning certain scientific information or certain social studies information as part of the reading program, and they are focused not just on teaching reading, but on making the notion of building knowledge. The kids are going to know more social studies and more science as a result of the classes, which actually isn't a new idea. In the 19th century, there was a whole 20, 30-year period when that's exactly what curricula looked like. They focused on content, frankly, over literature. And these newer programs, these newer efforts are kind of a mixed bag in that regard. Some of them pay attention to literature. Some of them maybe, lean a little more heavily on social studies and science. But basically what Nate was explaining is that there's very little research on these programs yet. And what is there isn't particularly powerful or positive. I know I've looked at some of the studies on it, and some of them don't pay attention to actually how much knowledge the kids are actually picking up. Some of them measure that, but they don't touch on reading comprehension. He mentions the Cabell work on that. And so the notion of, do we have studies showing that if you use these programs or this category of program, that kids will, one, increase their knowledge, and two, as a result of that, will read better than if they were working in another category of programs that have been more traditional. We just don't have that kind of evidence. That doesn't mean that it's a bad idea to try to design these programs or use these programs, but the folks who are making big claims that you have to do this or these are better or whatever, they're making that up. They just don't really know.
Wow. That's very interesting, Timothy, because it's very hard on social media. Some voices are so loud and it becomes kind of like confusing to somebody like me who's still in those classrooms coaching. And it makes you feel like, oh my God, I'm not using one of them. And then the other thing is, like, what defines even what is a quote unquote knowledge building program? Because as far as I understood, one of the schools that I'm supporting is using a knowledge quote unquote building program. But then I'm seeing on social media that that doesn't qualify as a knowledge building program. So like, I can't even wrap my head around it. And then now, from what I'm understanding, there's really no evidence and research to support that this is going to potentially shift student outcomes, but it seems like it's all the rage. And what concerns me is we got into a lot of problems during the balanced literacy days because of things that felt right or sounded right or things that we thought were important. And then we found out they weren't so important based on the research and evidence. So question number one is, what even defines a knowledge building program? And do I need to go beg my principal to reevaluate what he's doing? Because he was given a mandated list that didn't include, quote unquote, one of these knowledge building programs, or maybe some of them were and some of them weren't. I mean, this sounds like a hot mess, doesn't it?
It's a hypothesis, let's put it that way. And it's an interesting hypothesis, but Nate makes the point. We learn from all kinds of things. We learn when we're watching television. We learn when we're playing on the playground. We learn when we're talking to our buddies in the lunchroom. We learn when we're in our social studies and our science classes. We learn when we're reading poetry in our language arts class. Knowledge is coming into your head all kinds of ways. And so the notion here is, if you go out of your way in various ways to try to increase the amount of knowledge that you get specifically during your reading instruction, that somehow that's going to have a significant increase on how much knowledge you have, and it'll transfer to future reading comprehension. And those last 2 points are hypotheses. They're guesses. They're something that can be tested and should be tested, but have they been determined? Are they proven? No. No.
Well, you know what? Then we need to call some BS on this, because
I thought you were going to give Tim Shanahan a cheers.
well, yes, the cheers button is here. But my first reaction, based on what he was saying, is we need to call some BS on how we're all duped, that people think that the biggest issue is which program to pick. That's what is the controversy. Yet, let's take a step back and say, why are we choosing from any of these when we don't even know if, in fact, they're proven to work? So it doesn't even make sense. So I'm going to press a big BS button on that, because most people think when they are getting any of these programs, I'm not even going to say a name, but any of the knowledge building type programs, that it already is evidence-based. And
Hey, can somebody answer my question? What defines a knowledge building program?
Nate, do you want to tackle that? I don't know. Nate, are you there?
He's having some tech issues today.
Can you guys hear me?
Right now, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I'd love to try. I'll excuse myself. I have my daughter right next to me. Just trying to.
It's not your daughter being next to you.
She really wanted to be on camera.
Your daughter's welcome on the Literacy View. Everybody's welcome on the Literacy View. It doesn't matter how they feel. This is a totally inclusive, loving environment, and everybody's welcome.
Okay.
Hi.
All right. Well, I don't. Okay, there's his.
So, I think. Can you guys hear me?
All right, Nate. Yeah. Okay. We're going to have this conversation with just him. Okay. And I know it would have been great to have Nate.
Nate's coming back.
But he's going to come back when his study comes out. So we'll have Nate on separately, but he's having some technical difficulties. So let's go back to Judy's question.
Sure. I think, again, there's not any kind of official body that defines these things. So, anyone can claim anything. I think when we're talking about these kinds of programs, these knowledge building programs, essentially, I think what that means is a few things. One, it probably has a higher percentage of science and social studies text than has been true in typical textbook reading programs over the last several decades, certainly since since the 1950s anyway. So that's one thing. So, there's if I'm correct, and if Nate was correct, that we're learning information about our world all the time. The stories that we've been reading opens up certain things to you. These newer texts, if they have more science and social studies, give kids a greater opportunity to gain that particular knowledge. So that's one aspect of it. A second aspect of it is instead of kids reading, a series of texts that largely stand on their own. You read this cool story and this interesting biographical piece and this newspaper style article and so on. These programs, I would argue, have a greater content coherence than has been again typical over the last several decades, in that for the next 3 weeks, 6 weeks, I've heard 18 weeks in some. I'm not sure if that's true, but I got a letter from a teacher. But for several weeks, you're going to read associated articles or books or pieces, not terribly different than what many social studies and history middle school and high school teachers have done with text sets. We're going to study World War II. Here are 10 different texts about that. And we're going to read those. And by going back through the same information again and again, perhaps with different perspectives and so on, one would think you would have, whatever you learn from it would be more secure. You'd carry it away. You'd be more likely to remember it and so on. And that makes some sense in terms of building the knowledge. Doing those things certainly should increase certain kinds of knowledge. It might limit some other kinds of knowledge. As I said earlier, I think that some of these programs have more of a literature focus than others. And what they focus on in terms of knowledge differs. So, for example, you might be reading a story and their notion of the important knowledge in it is that it's set near some historical event that you just read 3 articles about, and that therefore the important things are the facts about that historical event. And so did you learn that there was a Jonestown flood? And and those kinds of things. And where is Jonestown? And all those kinds of things, Johnstown. Whereas something that's taking more of a literary focus might be the knowledge they might be emphasizing might have to do more with compassion, venality, other, various kinds of personality traits and aspects of human development and so on, that usually don't show up in social studies books or in science books. And so you can get into some pretty good arguments about what counts as knowledge, what matters here and what knowledge should you be focused on. And so if we focus on a literary unit and the key ideas have to do with conflict and plot and theme and those kinds of issues, that's knowledge, and you can use that for various things. You might focus on facts that come up in the, oh, look, this was in 1900 and Teddy Roosevelt had just become president, and on and on and on with that kind of stuff. Or it could be, gee, we're learning about honesty and integrity and what it means to be honest. And does that mean you have to tell people hurtful things? And why? Because that was what the story was about. And that was the author's theme. And we thought that was really important that kids get that. So, gee, one story, three very different conceptions of what the important information that you want kids to carry away from it would be. And so essentially, these programs are putting their nickel, making a bet that those cultural facts, those historical facts, and so on would be the important things to pull out of that story. Somebody with maybe if this is an English literature class, they're going to be thinking, no, all those things about how you analyze text, how you analyze story is most important. And somebody who is maybe just focused on really looking at literature as a source of knowledge about human development, human relationships, and wanting to focus on that knowledge. They all matter. Which ones are going to generalize the most? Which ones would actually matter in your future reading? That's a guess.
So, Tim, look, when I was in the classroom, I know that social studies was marginalized. If kids had to be pulled for extra help, often it would be during the social studies block. Some schools actually have a period where kids go off to extra help. But in general, if something had to go in the day, it was social studies. And I don't think we ever really got that social studies period right. And before we jump to this whole idea, well, why don't we integrate social studies, possibly science, into the ELA block? Why aren't we looking at the social studies block first to give kids a chance to be able to read fiction and books? Like, I know I was a junior great books leader. I'm sure you know of junior great books. And that was really important. We sat in a circle, we would go deeply into the text, and we taught kids a whole system of inquiry, not the teacher asking questions, but teaching students how to ask questions about what they're reading. And I would think that before we jump to getting a brand new program that's knowledge building, why don't we start building knowledge and making sure that kids have a really good social studies period during the day? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I agree with what you said 100%. I just want to add, and science and the arts as well. If about 20 years ago or so, about 20 years ago, I was reading a newspaper article in the Washington Post. It was a local, I think somebody had sent it to me, in fact. And it was by their local education reporter. It wasn't meant to be a national story, but it was in a local school district. And a teacher was essentially making a complaint that because she had to teach reading 2 hours a day, there was no chance that she could teach social studies or science. And it was terribly unfair that her kids weren't getting that because of the 2 hours of reading and writing. Well, the reporter was very sympathetic, and other people that she interviewed were sympathetic. And I was initially, when I first read it, but then I started to think about it. And I went to I've checked this a number of times. The U.S. Department of Education keeps certain information about schools around the country. And one of the things they keep is how long is the academic school day, minus lunch and recess kind of thing. And the average elementary school day is 6.5 hours in the United States. And most schools, it probably is 6.5 hours. And there's some that are a bit less and some a bit more, but 6.5 hours. And you say, well, I know the math people insist on an hour of math. And I know the reading and writing people insist on a couple hours. That's 3 hours. So that only leaves us another 3.5 hours a day to teach other things. I can see why no one can do anything. I mean, if you're going to use 3 of the hours on reading, writing, and math, how could anybody teach anything else? Why do we even have to have school in the afternoon? So it comes across as a kind of a silly notion. What we should be doing is insisting that school day is well used, and that we should be building knowledge of the arts, of social studies, science, and we have hours to do it. Roughly 15, 18 hours a week that we should be spending on those things across the school year. So 100% Faith, I agree with you. That's the starting point. Do we have strong social studies teaching? Do we have strong science teaching? Are kids learning the arts? And that means both being able to do things like, draw and paint and things like that on the art side. But it also means knowing stuff about it, getting a little art history, learning what, some pictures are and who certain artists are. And in social studies and so on, getting a coherent picture of history, certainly some insights on things like economics and certainly geography, and the sciences, life sciences, physical sciences, and so on. And if you look, we have standards in those areas. What happens is that because we test in reading and we test in math, a lot of stuff gets blown off, and we shouldn't accept that as a profession, and parents shouldn't accept that for their kids. It is perfectly reasonable for a government to monitor how kids are doing in certain areas, and that doesn't give people the right to ignore the rest of the rules and the laws and the regulations at what they're supposed to be teaching. And we see school boards that say, we have an internet, we don't need a social studies book. Teachers can find what they need. Teachers don't have one. A lot of teachers wouldn't know what to find in that area because they weren't necessarily history majors or whatever. But they certainly don't have the time to do that. And that certainly wouldn't be a good use of their time if they did. So absolutely, let's make sure that kids are getting the content instruction they should get. That's one thing. A second thing, though, is it does make sense to make sure that kids are actually learning things about their world in their reading classes. One thing that means is it really matters what text we have kids read. That whole notion, and I've said it, and it's idiotic. Other people say it, and they shouldn't be. It doesn't matter what kids are reading as long as they're reading. No, no. It does matter what they're reading. We want them to read the best literature. We want them to read history. We want them to read science and so on. That's a given. We, for too long, neglected the kinds of texts that would not just expand kids' knowledge, but would give them some kind of support in learning how do you read science, how do you read social studies, because you don't read them in exactly the same way. So there are things that really can happen in the reading class that, beyond building knowledge, there's more to reading than learning facts about history. There are things that we want our kids, things that they need to know about decoding and morphology and vocabulary. There are things about language that I doubt that they're going to learn in a science lesson or a social studies lesson that are really important in reading too. And so the notion that all the reading time should be focused on making sure kids got the social studies knowledge that they should be getting in their social studies class just doesn't make a lot of sense. On the other hand, should kids be reading more social studies and science text within reading than they used to? I think so. I've been on that since the mid-1970s. So, that's a given. one thing I've pushed with one of my publishers for a very long time, and I've usually lost these arguments. It seems to me that a lot of times in reading classes, we give kids the wrong message. That we, for example, you'll have a weekly test or a unit test, all these different assessments that people insist on, and you'll test the vocabulary that was taught. You'll test maybe a comprehension strategy that you wanted the kids. You've got these different things that you have kids try to do, but you don't ask them any questions about any of the texts that you had them read, about those authors, about those particular cultural touchstones, about some of these content issues that I've been raising. And I think that's a huge mistake, because it tells the kids, yeah, we read that stuff, but don't bother to remember it. That doesn't make any sense to me. So the folks that are promoting knowledge aren't crazy, but they're getting they're trusting themselves too much. They're believing that just because they have strong beliefs about something, that must be right. We know enough about history, and we know enough about human development to know that that's often just not the case. So let's use our knowledge there too.
Yes. Yeah. So Judy, we've had this conversation multiple times on the Literacy View and just on the phone, right? The two of us talking
all the time.
All the time. And so, what I'm hearing Tim say is just what we've been talking about, that certainly knowledge is important. All these subject areas are important. How about we give some attention to all the subject areas? And when kids are reading, rigorous text, that there's no reason that we can't go and reach to see if they have the knowledge to support something that they're reading, and fill in when we have to. But is it necessary to have a knowledge building program? And what I'm hearing him say is that we don't really have the research to support that. So in your school, Judy, you have a core
I'm not
program.
talking only about my school.
No,
today.
but I'm just
I have
saying
so many things here on my list.
Yes, I'm just saying you have a core program. And so how does this resonate with you in terms of what you're using, what you've seen, some of your thoughts? You said you have some questions. So how does it all sit with you?
Okay, I think a lot of it is easier said than done. I think schools are really struggling in general in the field. I think there's so many different things going on. So I do definitely see a big push now to squeeze things in rather than to do things because they're important. I see more squeezing in social studies, squeezing in science, rather than really thinking it through really intentionally and thoughtfully. And I think teachers are extremely overwhelmed because now, on top of teaching their ELA and their phonics and their phonemic awareness and their small group instruction to teach kids how to read, now they're being told very often, oh, and now you also have to do science and social studies and make sure everything's happening. And I think a lot of teachers are freaking out because in many classrooms, there's many kids that are struggling to read, and teachers are just trying to wrap their head around, we know knowledge is important, but how do we make sure that we get everything done? And also, how do we make sure that the kids come out of our classrooms, understanding and enjoying and understanding things, but also being able to come out as a reader where they can actually read the text themselves and not just listen to the teacher read the text. So it's pretty complicated. And then, I also see, in some schools, there's clusters teachers teaching other content areas like science and social studies to support the teachers. And then we have to think about how much training are those people getting in terms of what the research and evidence is saying about, strategies. We know that there is research to support comprehension strategies. And are those people that are instructing, up to par. So there's so much going on. So there's struggling students that need to learn how to read and write, teachers that are really stressed out because they're told they have to do more and more and more. So kind of like, even though I know that there's not that much research and evidence to support that a knowledge building program is going to shift the needle, maybe the intention is good, because maybe there's people. First of all, we know some of the intentions are about making money. Let's be honest, right? There's people that want to profit, but maybe some of the intentions are to help teachers by saying, okay, there's something that's better and it covers this and it covers that. So you don't need to do separate this and separate that because it's embedded in this. I'm just trying to make sense of it all. And then I really can't. And it's hard because I just feel bad for the kids in those classrooms that, of course, they need to know more about the world that they live in. And of course, they should be able to read. But, are we giving kids enough? And are we giving kids enough time to actually think, but also read? And I think that what I'm seeing most lately in the field is kids aren't getting enough time to even read. And maybe they came in with some knowledge, but are we giving all kids access to read? And also the other thing, and I've said it on other podcasts that we've recorded, who defines what knowledge is important for kids? Who makes that judgment? Who is the decider that this is what's important? Because what's important to Faith might be really different than what's important to me, and might be really different for the kids in my classroom. Of course, we know that there's knowledge that we should all have, but anyway, I'm all over the place.
Well, Judy, let me jump in on that last bit, because that whole notion of, these folks could be right that knowledge building should be part of the reading curriculum and so on, and still have it not come out well simply because they build the wrong knowledge that isn't going to be useful. Now, certainly, these aren't idiots. They're not dumb people. They're going to come up with things that they think are going to be useful and helpful and interesting and provocative and so on. I don't look at their curricula, because since I'm involved in curricula design, that gets tricky. So I don't do it and I don't critique them. Occasionally I'll see an outline for something like, oh, here's a list of topics that they're addressing. And I might look and say, as a former primary grade teacher, well, gee, I don't know that I'd be teaching that one to second graders. That one, is probably more for older kids or whatever. But, we're all making judgments and that's fine. But there's probably some of the best work being done on knowledge building and its association to reading is the work of James Kim at Harvard. And what let's think about this, that we do have research that says, look, if I'm going to have you read a text right now about a particular topic, and I familiarize you with ideas in there, if I front load and build some prior knowledge or get you to think about stuff you already know about that, I can raise your comprehension of that specific text. And so we're going to read about koala bears. I teach you about koala bears for the 15 minutes before we read it. And now you read it and somehow you come away with more facts, more information. You understand koala bears better. That we know works. The problem with that, of course, is if I spend the next 3 weeks teaching you about koala bears, when's the next time you're going to read about that or see a TV program that is really going to help you, that you have that information? And so that gets to be, it's like vocabulary. Vocabulary doesn't have as powerful an immediate effect as you'd expect, because a lot of texts won't have the same words in them. And so I can teach it. It helps you with a text that has that word, but it doesn't help you with another text. And it's the same way with a lot of the information that folks are teaching in these curricula. Jimmy Kim had a more interesting idea of it, is it possible to build kids' knowledge in some way that will allow them to generalize to different topics? That's pretty interesting. That makes it more powerful. Then it isn't just a list of facts that, gee, I hope I can remember, who won the War of 1812 or what that was about, so that, and he found first it took more than one study to kind of figure out how to do it and so on. It wasn't easy. It wasn't just, oh yeah, you just teach kids a bunch of information and then they generalize it. That's not what they found. But they did find that you could teach certain things in a way that would allow kids to see that as maybe a framework that then could be applied to other different topics and that would improve kids' comprehension of those. Are we ready to specify what that kind of a curriculum would look like? No, we need more research on that. But it certainly suggests to me that this notion of let's just get a bunch of facts in kids' heads and then it's all going to be fine, they're going to read better, is not fully thought through. Isn't ready to be realized as a curriculum that's certain or even highly likely to have a big impact on future comprehension.
So Tim, I want to ask you about excerpts. That came up also in our Facebook group. And, again, it's like, to me, it's one big duh. Of course, we want kids to read books, the same way we want them to be knowledgeable. And yet people will attack if you have something different to say. And so, could you talk a little bit about the whole idea of, using whole books, which I know you've said, I know you've written about this, that often a core program will allow for reading whole books as well. Nobody's stopping people from having whole books in the classroom.
But some programs have less of it, Faith. The honest
Absolutely.
That's true. But I could tell you from my experience, my principal, when I was teaching in Brooklyn, he made sure that kids had whole sets of books in addition to what we were teaching. And I remember,
I think I know what the problem is. Right now, people got very married to the word fidelity, and people are afraid, Faith, possibly to deviate from exactly what the program says and what the pacing calendar says. And because of that fear, you might be given something that's imperfect and be afraid to deviate.
Yeah.
Well, again, I just want to say that I get the idea with what you're saying, but no one has ever stopped a school from having whole books in the classroom and using a book. I remember using the Phantom Toll Booth. I remember using Charlotte's Web. It was not in a core program, and yet that whole set of books moved from classroom to classroom.
I saw that. I'm going to say something controversial. I'm sorry, I have to stop. I saw more of that during my balanced literacy days in the classroom. I'm going to be honest. I saw more book studies. I saw more thematic units, and I actually may have seen more knowledge building in the classroom. There was a little bit more freedom sometimes. I could just go right into my social studies spiel all the time with my class and incorporate it in.
Let's ask the expert. We have Tim Shanahan.
Wow, this is getting wild. Am I getting a little too wild, Tim?
No, you're not, Judy. The problem that we have when it comes to knowing what's going on in schools is that nobody really keeps track. And so we all have our experiences with it. And actually my experiences on that last part that you were saying, I would agree with you, but that's based on a really narrow set of schools around the country that I happen to have visited over the years and so on. So I always, when people say, this is what teachers do, or this is how schools run, I know it differs dramatically from region to region. And, there are places where particular textbooks are used and you go to a different state or a different part of that state and almost nobody uses it there and they use some other kind of thing. So when we all fall into it of, well, this is what teachers do, or this is how it's changed over the last 10 years. I do know that's one of the things that the folks who are arguing for whole books, they keep saying they want to go back to how it was, or, we used to teach with. Well, I got to tell you, if you look at the history of education and literacy education in the United States since 1620, frankly, most reading instruction took place with short works, short stories, short articles, excerpts, poems, prayers, and so on. From 1620 through at least World War II. A little different with high school English classes. Those, though, didn't see themselves as teaching reading. They were teaching literature and wanted kids to read certain novels and so on. And you know that overlaps, but it's not quite the same thing. You see it in these arguments that people will be making high school arguments for why the second graders should only be reading books, and it's like, really, where's that coming from? So that's one piece of it, that in the 1950s, maybe late 1940s, people started the idea of, well, maybe we should be using whole books to teach kids. It's probably the first time economically where that was possible. And that publishers were actually putting out books for kids that you could buy in classroom quantities and make that work. Things like independent reading start from that, and or self-selected reading start from that. That goes on very on the fringe during those years. In the late 1960s, publishers start to try to be eclectic. They want to include in lots of different. So they're going to have phonics. They're going to have the only one I can remember is one of the publishers, and I don't know if they're part of something else, but they're not freestanding anymore. Ginn was a company, Ginn, and in the reason I remember is just because the clever name they put on their books. They would have the kids working with a basal reader. But then you could pull in a unit with what they called satellite books, right? Like a satellite, they go around the program. And so you could, we just, read these short selections. Excerpts always means you're taking a piece of something else. And programs do use excerpts, but they also use short stories. They use, they use complete works too, just not books necessarily. And some will have a unit, maybe a unit each semester for a book, or they'll have an option that you can, bring in a book here or there. And that sort of went on for a while. Lucy Calkin's units of study, was a book-driven curriculum. They didn't have any kind of selections for kids to read. They had, books, and she would sell a library that you could buy for your classroom that would have, multiple copies of various kinds of books and so on, and picked very high quality books. But in her teacher material, she would say, you could just get books at any garage sale and stuff. It didn't matter what the kids were reading, which again is one of those things I kind of grabbed my head. But again, it was a book oriented kind of curriculum. Now we're starting to see some of these curricula that are, well, we only use books. Okay, well, that's nice. I don't know, what makes a 30-page book, better for teaching kids than a 10-page, short story or whatever. But the notion that we want kids doing both, that Faith said, is absolutely right. I can't imagine anybody being against, encouraging kids to read books. Admittedly, Judy, it was a different time when I was a teacher, and we did have more freedom than teachers do now. As a third grade teacher, I would work with basal readers for usually about a 3 to 6 week period. And then I would take the kids to the group to, because I was working with small reading groups, I would take the each of the groups to the library and have them do self-selection, find books that they wanted to work with. And then we'd bring those back to the group, and we would, if we were focused on prediction during that 3 to 6 week period, guess what I had them doing with the books that they were then trying to apply those skills to. And of course, the kids, even though most of the stuff in the Basel readers at the time were stories, most of the books the kids were picking out were about how ice skating and, different topics that some of it was stories, but kids were interested in a lot of stuff. And so the notion of giving them opportunities to do that kind of reading seemed important to me. So there is absolutely no research saying one is better than the other. That doesn't mean one isn't better than the other, but we don't have any evidence. And so we can all have opinions about it. But go ahead, Judy.
I want to ask you another question, Timothy. So I know we've had an episode from the UK with Kathy Rassel, and she was saying that in the UK, they actually, I think for the early grades, right, Faith, they just do read alouds, and they don't have a quote unquote knowledge building program or anything like that. And they have excellent results that are based on the skills and the standards. Any thoughts on that? Faith, you're muted.
It wasn't just read alouds. They just didn't have.
No, but it was like they had certain ones for every single grade that were specific and aligned to the standards.
Right, I just want to mean it just wasn't read alouds. It
Yeah.
was kids reading. It was kids reading those books too.
And they were having great results, though, was her point, though. They don't have any of these big, bulky programs.
Right. Well, I mean, it's very reasonable to have a canon, possibly easier in a country like in the UK, but of course that's changing there. They're getting a much more diverse population, and the more diverse your population, a lot more arguments over what should be in that canon, what should we be reading about. But if you can get the agreements, there's just no question that when I'm in Europe, I was just in Europe recently. Certainly one of the things that if you talk to adults and about their schooling, one of the things they love is that no matter what school somebody went to or where they're from in the country, everybody knows the same stories. Everybody knows the same, books and so on. What she was telling you won't reveal is it better to do that way or another way? The fact is, people have been learning to read with short works for 400 years. Could they learn better with longer works? That is certainly possible, but that's an empirical question. And so am I arguing that shorter works are better than longer works? I am not. I am definitely not making that argument. But I'm also not making the argument that it's necessarily better the other way. I wrote a piece about this recently, and the point of it was, one, to point out there isn't research on it, and therefore everything is opinion. And two, to point out that to make things really work well for kids in terms of what you want them to learn, you have to adjust. If you're working with shorter works, you have to make certain adjustments and do certain things. If you're working with longer works, you've got to make certain adjustments and do certain things. They require that you do some very different things at times as far as I can see, they can accomplish a lot of the same thing. There's a lot of overlap.
Tim, I have to ask this question. It's been on my mind, but this
my gosh, is something crazy about to happen? Poor Tim. What did he get himself into?
People have been saying that that people outside of education should be making these decisions because educators have messed it up. And basically, we've trusted educators to run the show, and that, we should kind of allow people outside of education, without education degrees, to really have a large say in what's happening in reading. I'd like your thoughts on that.
I think that the general public, I mean, the people who are saying that really mean they want to call the shots. I mean, well, you see it on social media. There are people who they know business and therefore they want you to do things their way. And, they don't necessarily know anywhere as much as a typical kindergarten teacher knows about teaching. But let's set those aside. The general public definitely has an important role to play in a lot of curricular decisions. And let me give you some examples of that, and then I'll pull it back to reading. But there are a lot of things, frankly, that are values judgments about what we want our kids to know. If we're talking about social studies history, what's more important for our kids? Is it to know a lot of American history, or is it world culture? What should be the balance there? Where do you want more? Universities fight over this. You get history departments and we have our Europeanists and we have our Americanists and blah, 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 and they fight for positions and they fight for a place in the curriculum. That's a judgment call it's not scientific. It's not, teachers don't have any special grasp on that. So I think the general public should have a real voice there. Science, the same thing. And it differs by community. I mean, for example, I was in the Cleveland area a few years ago and got into this discussion and gee, what's more important, physical science or life science? Now, in the Cleveland area, one of their big economic drivers is their medical system. So guess what they'd like their kids to be learning more of in high school? More life sciences. Go out to Montana, where mining and things like that are the most important economic drivers. Physical science is clearly much more important. Teachers don't have any special grasp of that. We're members of the community.
Good point. Faith, you got to get that cheers button out. That's a really good one. You're muted, Faith.
I'm sharing the whole conversation. I love this.
So when it comes to reading and when it comes to how do you teach science, or what's the best way to teach history? Should you be using text sets or textbooks? I think the public should stay the heck out of that. I don't think that's really where you need business people or generals or whoever jumping in. And it's the same, reading reading's an ability. Reading's a set of skills. It's not a body of information. Not saying there's no information to it, but it's not a special body of information. That's the reason why we turn to science. What works best? Gee, if we teach phonics, does that help? Those kinds of things. And that, I don't really think the public should be saying, well, I don't like phonics. I didn't like that in school. No, we got a lot of research saying that gives kids a benefit. We're going to do that because we think we can get more kids to a higher level of it. And so when it comes to what do you want your kids reading within reading instruction, do you want them reading more factual stuff or more fiction? Do you want them reading, focusing on human traits and human development and human relationships, or do you want them focusing on historical and scientific facts that might be included in a work of science fiction or might be recorded in a piece of historical fiction? Where do you want that emphasis? Where do you want that balance? Their opinions are as good as ours, as far as I'm concerned. They know every bit as much about what they want their kids to have as I do. I know what I want my grandchildren to have, but I'm just a person. I'm just, one more citizen. I don't have any special knowledge on that. And it's perfectly legitimate for people in a community to say, maybe we don't know right now, and maybe it works the same both ways, but man, there are some books I really want my kids to read, and I'd like a teacher to take them through it. And so I want that to be part of the curriculum. And if you find out that that's not as good as something else, then come back to me. I'll change my mind. But, so I don't have any problem with people outside the community weighing in, but when it's, well, this is what I always liked, or, I talked to my daughter and she didn't like that her teacher did this, so I don't think anybody should do that. It's like, that's really not the best way to make those kinds of decisions. So parents, communities, big role in education. I'd love to see it, but not in making those kinds of teacherly decisions. There are things that we have special knowledge on, that we really do know more about it. And some of that is scientific knowledge, the kind of stuff that Nate and I, help bring to the table. But then there's also the knowledge of somebody who's been teaching a particular way or has tried it different ways. Their insights can be really useful as well. So it's not just scientific knowledge, it's also craft knowledge, it's experience. And again, the larger community doesn't bring that to the table. And so, their opinions on those things, you might find them interesting, but I don't find them terribly informative.
I think that he said the magic word that people need to be clear when they're giving their opinion versus when something's evidence and research based is very, very different. And I think that sometimes things get very muddy for some people online, that something might look like it's factual, but it's an opinion-based piece. And I think that it's really important to be transparent. Tim, I just read one of your pieces. I think it was from years ago about sound walls versus word walls. And you very clearly stated that something was your opinion about something. And I appreciate that about you. And I wish that more people in the field were really clear, because I think that as a practitioner still working in schools, that clarity is it means a lot. It means a lot.
There's definitely a difference between when I'm telling folks what the research says and when I'm giving a personal opinion. Does my opinion count any more than anybody else's? Well, it should count for something. I do have a lot of experience. I've been doing this for a while, but it shouldn't hold the same water that, we have 37 studies on this showing that it works a particular way. What would you care what my opinion was on that? I mean, it shouldn't matter. I do try to make it very clear. And I think I do more of this than anybody of, this is what we know. This is my take on it, or I'm not going to give you my take on it. Who cares what my take on it is? I'm not sharing that with the world.
Well, I think we will look forward to Nate's meta-analysis on this topic that we're talking about. I look forward to that. That's in December, and hopefully we will bring Nate on, and he'll have a better time with his audio. And we thank you, Tim, for joining us.
Wait a minute.
I was just going to say, so Tim.
Wait. Before you go, let me have my 2 seconds, because that's the final part. I want to know, Tim, are you still a Swiftie?
Oh, I am, though I actually, because I've been out of the country for a while, I really didn't get a chance to really listen to this latest album. So I don't have any opinions about Elizabeth Taylor or anybody else.
Anybody else? And then the other thing, before we do our final thing, we didn't mention the word strategies. When I think about knowledge, that's something that's always on my mind. Any last things you might want to say about knowledge and its correlation to strategies and how those two things work together?
Yeah, I guess what I'd like to say is most important is knowledge matters. Knowledge of the world matters in reading. We use it. I hope I've made that case, and we could pull in hundreds of research studies on that. There are other things that matter in reading as well that kids also have to learn. And so if you put all your eggs in the knowledge basket, you're probably not going to be doing what you need to do to help kids develop language. And written language is different than oral language. There are a lot of things that kids have to learn there. There are lots of things we should be focusing on there that we haven't been. We've tried to skip it by putting kids in text so easy that they don't really need any instruction. But what we really should be doing is putting kids in texts that are demanding enough that they actually need some guidance so that we can increase their knowledge development. A third thing is there are actions that we take as readers to try to understand things better, to try to remember things. Some of those are famous strategies like stopping to summarize when you're reading, which really helps, or asking yourself, kind of quizzing yourself about what you're reading, asking yourself questions, seeing if you can answer them, or going back and figuring it out, monitoring your comprehension. Kids get into just reading words. It's decoding's kind of fun, and they do it, and at the end of it they have no idea what they read. And so being self-aware and paying attention, those kinds of strategies. But there are lots of other things that we don't talk about in that strategy bag, like what happens when you come to a word you don't know. Do you make a judgment about whether it's important or not? I hope you do. If you decide it's important, do you know how to use context to get that word's meaning, or can you break it down morphologically? Those are strategies. What do you do when you come to a sentence that you don't know what the heck the author's talking about? Do you know how to break a sentence like that down? Where do you break it? How do you do that? How do you put it back together? What do you do to keep track of an idea as it runs through a text? Because authors use synonyms, and they use ellipses, and they use pronouns and to refer to things, and kids get lost, readers get lost in that. How do you know? So the notion that there is just sort of one narrow set of strategies and you can learn them in 12 minutes and 47 seconds, well, there is some truth that those strategies exist, and you probably can learn some of them pretty quickly. But there are a lot of things that good readers do when they're trying to make sense of a text, and that when they're trying to make sense of different genres of text and different types of text. And so that's why you need reading instruction, and not just social studies instruction, or not just science instruction. So I think a lot of folks go, yeah, you don't need much of that kind of thing. I don't think they really recognize how challenging the language is for a lot of our kids, how challenging the thinking while reading is for a lot of kids. And there's some real teaching to be done there. And every one of those things I mentioned, there's a large body of research behind them saying, yeah, and that makes a difference. And there's actually more of the teaching research on those, and there isn't enough of that, but there is more on those than there is on the knowledge piece. So these folks are trying to build.
Could they use those strategies in a knowledge building program?
You definitely could. And that's why, this argument over, well, what should the texts be about? They should be about important stuff. They should be about things we want kids to know about. What constitutes knowledge from them? That, I think we have some pretty good arguments that we need to have, and that there's a little bit more than opinion there. So there are some people who can really bring important information to that table, but a lot of that is just values, judgments, and I don't have anything special to give you on that. I know what I think is important for my kids and my grandkids, but I would not push to impose that on the rest of the world.
So Tim, to wrap up, give us 3 BS things in education. You can do it. Come on, call BS on a few things that you want people to know.
Well, one would certainly be that if you want kids to make maximum learning progress, you have to teach them with books at their instructional level. That's certainly a big one. It seems to be holding more kids back than helping them. So that's one I would throw out. The notion that when it comes to reading disciplinary texts or content area texts, social studies, science, those kinds of things, that the only thing the kids really have to learn there is the content, is a huge mistake. There's a large body of research there showing that really smart people can have difficulty reading those kinds of texts because they often don't understand the purposes. They don't understand the nature of the evidence. They don't understand the way language is used. That gets in the way of understanding, and people sort of just go, well, I'm not good at science, or I don't ever feel comfortable with history, instead of go, oh no, there were things you could have learned there. There are things we could teach you that would make it possible. for you to do that. And I guess the third one is more general, but it's what you guys have been talking about, this last part of what we're talking about. And that's this notion that the louder you say it makes your opinion right, rather than
Say it again. Say it again.
Tim is making Faith go wild. I've never seen Faith this wild on the literacy view. She's going bonkers.
You hit the nail on the head. Say it again, please.
Just saying things louder doesn't make them right. Your opinion is still an opinion. The way that you have to win these arguments isn't by backing down. It isn't running away or being afraid to say anything. You need evidence. It isn't enough to just say, I believe it, or it's impossible to get. During the balanced literacy thing or during whole language, we're going to make kids lifelong lovers of reading. Well, how are we going to measure that? Well, you can't possibly measure that. We won't be able to measure that for 50 years if that's worked. So you're going to sell me something that we can't possibly know if it does any good for 50 years. I don't want to buy it. People are starting to give the same kinds of arguments for some of these newer curricula. They have to have evidence showing. It's one thing to say, we believe we can make our program with different text work every bit as well as the programs out there. I have no problem with anybody saying that. But when they claim, oh, this is superior, this works better, this will make kids better readers, say that you hope that that's the case. Say that that's what you're trying to build for. Say that's where you're looking for evidence to come in. Don't say that that's a proven fact. That's unfair to kids. That's unfair to the society. And yelling it doesn't fix it.
Nope. And just to wrap up, what are you excited about? What are you cheering about in education?
It looks like, at least some of the data that have been coming across my desk lately, is that kids are coming back to school, which it took us more than 100 years to get the attendance levels that we had, say, in 2019. And we've knocked it back 40 years or something. But the numbers are looking better all the time. I wish it'd go faster, but I'm so excited that kids more of them are back in school. And I think that also means, I'm not seeing much on this, but I think that also means more teachers are in the classroom and are losing fewer days again. So I'm having teachers and kids together, guys. That's a victory. That's one of the best things we do for our children.
Tim Shanahan, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's a delight. You just are a breath of fresh air when you share the actual evidence and the research with our listeners. So thank you again for taking the time to be with us. And we hope people will be looking for your book. Again, the exact title is Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives.
And we'll put the link in the show notes too, right?
Absolutely. We will put it in the show notes.
Put it in the show notes, and I will send you a discount number so they can get some money off on buying it.
Whoa, yay. Now that's something to cheer about.
I didn't think of it. I don't have it in front of me, but I'll.
That would be really, really great.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm honored.